Imagine working hard all year, earning money for your country, only to be told that half of it has to be sent to another country before you can even use the rest. Sounds unfair, right? Well, that's exactly what's been happening to several African nations for decades. Here's how it works. Many African countries, especially those that were once under French colonial rule, have been required to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in France under a system called the CFA franc. And guess what? This reserve isn't just sitting there in cash, it's mostly stored in gold. In simple terms, these countries make money, but before they can use it for things like building roads, schools, or hospitals, half of it has to be handed over to France. The remaining half, that's what they have to survive on. But wait, it doesn't end there. Some African nations have also been storing their gold reserves in the United States, specifically at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Why? Because after falling into heavy debt from institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, they were forced to use their gold as collateral, basically as a guarantee for the money they borrowed. Here's the shocking part. That gold has never been returned. Now imagine the frustration. Countries that should be thriving are instead stuck in a cycle where they owe money, can't access their own wealth, and have little control over their financial future. But something big is happening. Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso, is making bold moves to take back control of his country's gold and foreign exchange reserves. And he's not alone. The real question is, which other countries are joining him? How exactly is this happening? Before we dive into that, let's rewind a bit to understand the roots of this system and why it exists in the first place. When many African nations gained independence, France didn't just pack up and leave. Instead, it put a system in place to keep financial control over its former colonies. This system is called the CFA franc, a currency used by 14 African countries split into two groups. West African Economic and Monetary Union, WWAMU, includes Benin, Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo. Central African Economic and Monetary Community, CEMAC, includes Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon. Each of these countries still operates under a system that ties them to France's financial policies, limiting their ability to make independent economic decisions. But here's where things are starting to change. Imagine having a wallet full of money, but every time you want to use it, you have to ask someone else for permission. Most of the time, they say no. That's exactly what's been happening to several African countries for decades. Even though these nations have their own central banks, they don't actually control their own money. Here's why. A system put in place by France forces these countries to send at least half of their foreign currency reserves to the French treasury. That means before African nations can even use their own wealth for things like schools, roads, or hospitals, half of it is locked away in Paris, completely out of their reach. And it gets worse. Most of this reserve isn't even stored as cash. It's kept in gold, but not in African vaults, not in their own banks in France. This setup ensured that while African farmers, workers, and businesses generated wealth, a huge chunk of it was never kept in their own countries. Instead, it quietly slipped away into France's economy, making sure France stayed rich while Africa remained dependent. But that was only part of the plan. While this financial system, the CFA franc system, already kept African economies tied to France, the real exploitation happened through gold. See, many African countries are sitting on massive amounts of gold. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Côte d'Ivoire are among the world's top gold producers. You'd think that would mean prosperity for their people, right? Not quite. Instead of benefiting their own nations, this gold was automatically shipped off to Paris, long before it could be counted, taxed, or used for local development. How did France pull this off? First, they ensured that French companies dominated Africa's gold mining industry. These companies extracted massive amounts of gold, while paying barely anything in return. So even before governments could claim a share, most of the gold was already gone. Second, France forced these nations to store whatever gold reserves they did have in Paris, claiming it was necessary to guarantee the stability of their currency. But here's the catch. African governments couldn't access or use this gold without France's approval. Imagine working hard, only to realize that your money's sitting in someone else's bank account, and they won't let you withdraw it. That's the reality these African nations have been living with for decades. And as if that wasn't enough, France designed the CFA franc to be permanently tied to its own currency. First it was pegged to the French franc, and later to the euro. This meant African economies had zero flexibility. Their currency's value was dictated by decisions made in Europe, not by their own governments. These countries weren't just stuck with a currency they didn't fully control. They also had no power to adjust its value or manage their own financial policies. If any leader even tried to use their country's gold reserves to support their own economy, they were immediately blocked. But this wasn't just unfair. It was a way to keep African nations dependent, a system designed to make sure they could never truly break free from France's grip. And whenever someone dared to challenge it, the consequences were brutal. Take Thomas Sankara, for example. Sankara was the president of Burkina Faso in the 1980s, and he had a bold vision. He wanted his country to be truly independent, not just politically, but financially. He demanded the return of Burkina Faso's gold reserves, wanted to nationalize gold mining, and even planned to create a currency that wasn't controlled by France. And he wasn't just talking. Unlike other African leaders who took loans from the IMF and World Bank, which often kept countries trapped in debt, Sankara refused. That made him a problem. In 1987, he was assassinated in a coup led by Blaise Compaoré, a leader backed by France. The moment Compaoré took power, he erased everything Sankara stood for. The gold stayed in French vaults, the economy fell back under French influence, and Burkina Faso was once again locked into the same system Sankara had tried to escape. But he wasn't the only one who fought back. Another leader who tried to break free was Laurent Gbagbo, the former president of Côte d'Ivoire. Gbagbo believed that his country's gold should be used to develop Côte d'Ivoire, not sit in French banks making France richer. He openly questioned why an independent nation should have to store its wealth in another country. France didn't like that. Suddenly, Gbagbo was accused of election fraud, and in 2011, things took a shocking turn. French troops intervened directly, removed him from power, and handed him over to the International Criminal Court. Just like that, he was eliminated, and France made sure a pro-French leader took his place, one who wouldn't ask too many questions. For years, African nations struggled to resist because they were tied to the West, politically, economically, and even militarily. The system wasn't just about money, it was about control. Figures like Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, Assimi Goïta, Mali, and Abdourahmane Tiani, Niger, are taking bold steps to reclaim their country's financial independence. One of their first major moves, expelling French troops and tearing up old military agreements that kept them under foreign control. But this fight isn't just about military presence, it's about money, resources, and power.